Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this absolute whopper is an ATI Radeon 4870X2. Dating back to 2008, this card is made up of two once flagship 4870s stuck to a single board, which back in the day would have set you back roughly $550 US. With 1GB of GDDR5 VRAM per GPU, this thing was the definition of overkill, but it was still cheaper than buying two 4870s, and of course it would have also saved you the cost of buying a motherboard with two PCI Express slots. Design-wise, it looks incredible, if not a little flawed. One small fan at the end of the card for cooling two hot chips. Another issue with this card, though one caused by the never-ending inevitable continuation of time, is this thing's lack of DX11 support. As time moves on, old tech like this is eventually rendered obsolete, though as far as I'm concerned, obsolete, just like time itself, is a man-made concept, and as long as there is someone out there to enjoy this heavy behemoth of a graphics card, then it's still very much relevant. And well, I hope we can get some enjoyment out of it today. Of course, 10 or so years ago, Windows 10 didn't exist and common gaming resolutions were slightly different, but testing older hardware with modern scenarios also extends to newer software and aspect ratios as far as I'm concerned. Though I did have to use my older i5-3570K CPU for testing, as my Socket 1200 and AM4 motherboards wouldn't actually detect the card. Ignore any on-screen references to the i5-10400F then, as I labelled the CPU before switching the hardware, so I'll change this in the edit. Aside from hardware issues, the card officially supports Windows 8 or lower, but the drivers can still be installed manually in Windows 10 through Device Manager by running the Catalyst installer first and then going to the AMD installation location and selecting this file. The display will flicker as with any other driver installation, and the card will then work fine after a restart. Okay, so first of all we have GTA 5 at 1080p. Now I decided to try 1080p first, not really knowing what to expect. We'll jump into the settings here. Now the settings menu in GTA 5 is always quite stuttery if I'm using lower end hardware. I'm not going to pretend to know why it does this, but it just does. So as you can see, there are a few frame time issues with the graph on screen, and at 1920 by 1080 we are nearing that VRAM limitation, and we've got everything set to the normal quality, including textures. We've also got sharp shadows enabled as well, and of course any advanced settings are off. Now the game actually did surprisingly well at 1080p here. There were a few on-screen issues, as you can see, well, not just on screen but in-game as well, and by that I mean there were a few stutters, there were the occasional drops below 30 FPS, but if you were to lock the frame rate to 30, then it would be a playable experience a lot of the time, I'm going to say. But what we'll do here is actually switch the game to 720p in a moment just to see how things improve. So we'll jump back into the settings now, which again, of course, are stuttering. We'll go to the graphical options and we'll just change the resolution to 1280 by 720. As you can see, the VRAM usage hasn't really dropped too much. The display's just going to flicker here while everything adjusts with the capture card here. Another quick flicker there. Now as you can see, the frame rate is slightly improved and there are a lot less frame drops and stutters. The average didn't increase by all that much, but where we saw the real improvement, as I say, was with the dips. There were still some dips here, but 720p is definitely the way to play GTA 5. I've just wiped out a few pedestrians there. I always tend to do that. I wouldn't play the game normally like this, but I feel that doing this tends to give us a good idea of a worst case scenario with all the pedestrians on screen. The frame rate actually went up and over 80 FPS just now. I don't know if you saw that, but let's move on to our next title. So I had to record Overwatch at 30 FPS simply because the laptop I was using to capture the footage along with the capture card just isn't very good, to be honest. It's a dual-core machine with an old GTX 850M inside, which is fine for light gaming, but capturing footage, not so great. Now with Overwatch, I left things at 1080p once again with 75% resolution scaling, and surprisingly, although the footage looks a bit stuttery thanks to the 30 FPS capture, the game actually ran really well. The frame rate went up and over 90 on occasion, and overall the average was pretty good. We are of course using the 3570K CPU from Intel, which again really isn't struggling here, especially at this resolution, and overall it was certainly a playable experience. I couldn't remember whether or not Overwatch ran on DX 10.1, but clearly it does, and the game that I actually had the problem with was Fortnite, which I swear used to run on DX 10 and 10.1 cards, but it doesn't anymore. But yeah, Overwatch, well, it was a surprising result here. Now, I always say that Fallout New Vegas will run on anyone's PC, and indeed anyone's nan's PC too. 60 FPS is the natural cap of this game. If you turn that frame cap off, then there are going to be all sorts of physics issues. 60 FPS was easily achieved for the most part. We are at the New Vegas Strip here, which causes... Where did you come from? Causes the most problems, but even so, it was holding pretty steady. The frame times weren't too great, as you can see, but overall it was certainly a playable experience, and better than the experience that you're going to get on consoles, namely the PS3 and 360, which both run, I believe, at 30 FPS. Also, in less populated areas, the frame rate is going to hold closer to a constant 60 frames per second as well. Now, Crysis 2 back in the day was, of course, a pretty demanding title, though it wasn't as demanding as the first iteration of Crysis. I think that's because Crysis 2 and Crysis 3 came to consoles as well, so they had to be not necessarily dumbed down a bit because they still look fantastic, but they had to be better optimized, I think, for the PS3 and 360. At 720p on the 4870X2, we're seeing over 60 FPS. I think this game is naturally capped at somewhere around 63 or 64, I'm not 100% sure, but 720p is definitely the way to play here. Again, the CPU usage is a little higher with the 4 cores and 4 threads of this i5, but for the most part it's doing just fine. I'll try and find an i7 or something to go in this motherboard for future tests with older graphics cards. This is a particularly intensive part of the game as well, but it seems to run fine with this old beast, though I'm certainly smelling burning right now. Okay, let me just warn you, there are going to be some flashing images. If you are sensitive to flashing images, please look away now. This is Call of Duty Black Ops. Again, it runs at 1080p, but it doesn't really matter the resolution I choose or the settings because we did encounter some horrible flickering issues, as you can see here. Now, this isn't as bad as it gets. If we move around this corner here, then yeah, there we go. The environment just starts to really mess around on us. Now, this is either because of the crossfire enabled on this card, or it's simply because of the latest 13.4 beta drivers. I'm not quite sure. 13.4 is the latest driver option available for this card, so it could be that. The game did, of course, come out after the card itself, or it could just be that Crossfire is enabled. But even so, despite the flickering problems, the game will run at close to the 62 FPS cap a lot of the time, though that will depend on the map you're playing. Battlefield 3 did run for a brief moment at about 60 FPS from what I saw. I can't guarantee that, and then this happened, and I had to switch off the system at the mains. Yeah, it was quite bad, but moving on. So the final game we tested was CSGO. Again, I had to record this at 30 FPS due to my crappy laptop, basically, and the capture card not playing nicely with it. CSGO, I didn't really benchmark properly here because it ran at over 100 FPS. It is, of course, more CPU dependent, so the GPU doesn't really do much. We are running at the lowest in-game settings here, and this will run absolutely fine on the 4870. You've got nothing to worry about on this old card, but that's going to be it for now. We will test some more games, I should say, in the future with this card, I think, just to see how Crossfire is handled in a few other titles, a few of the later titles that were available and supported with Crossfire, of course. But for now, thank you very much for watching. This card is certainly fun to mess around with. It's a very hot and very heavy beast, and I hope you've enjoyed watching. If you did, leave a like on it down below, leave a dislike if you didn't. Let me know if you've ever had one of these in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.